Hi, welcome back to Intro to Soc. This week we're going to be talking a little bit about sociological theory, focusing primarily on who I like to call the big three. So that's going to be Durkheim, Marx, and Weber, and you'll see their theories kind of pop out throughout the rest of this course. So to get started, let's talk about some learning objectives. First, where did sociology come from? How was sociology distinguished from other social and physical sciences? Then we'll talk about each of the theorists individually. So before we get started on the big three, I want to mention Auguste Comte. So he's considered the founder of sociology. He was a French philosopher, and he essentially was interested in understanding the causes and the consequences of the French Revolution specifically. So what made the French Revolution happen? How did the revolution kind of change the course of history? And his idea was that we should try to understand how society works and learn to solve its problems. So a big thing for Comte was positivism. And you'll probably hear this term maybe in some other classes, but essentially Comte rejected the idea that the social order was a result of God or just a supernatural. So back in old times, somebody might have gotten sick. And instead of assuming, oh, it's because we have poor healthcare or our water isn't clean or we don't practice safe sex, they would have assumed, this happened because this person displeased God. So Comte is challenging this idea and instead argues in favor of positivism, which is a perspective that contends that society and the social world can be studied using experiments, observation, and statistics, and is governed by laws that may help to guide us in making predictions about future behaviors, patterns, and trends. So essentially, he argues that the social world isn't just up to fate, right? It's something that can be studied in a way that's scientific. There are things and trends and patterns that we can actually observe, and we can use those patterns that we observe to kind of predict what's going to happen next. So moving on to Emile Durkheim, he's also considered like the father of sociology. So he was a French sociologist as well, interested specifically in how to study society in a scientific way. He argued that the social world is unique from that of the biological and psychological, meaning that we can't just explain what happens in society purely based on psychological and biological explanations. Do they matter? Sure. Do they have some weight? Of course. But there's something else that's going on here, and he wanted to figure out what that is. And he argued that people are affected not just by internal factors and illnesses, so that again would be things like memory, cognition, the things that psychology focuses on, but also by external social factors or those social conditions that we talked about earlier. So for Durkheim, he equated society to kind of being like a human body. So he called it the social body. He argued that society is made up of individuals and groups that each have a job or a function to do to keep society going. So if one part of the society is sick, this is going to cause problems in other areas. So let's think to institutions, right? So we've got the church, we've got family, we've got mass media, the government, the law, things like that. So for example, you might notice that when families are struggling, that can lead to some problems happening within the education system. We're seeing that right now, right? So a lot of families are struggling with finances. They're struggling because both parents have to work and they can't have a parent home anymore. And that's kind of causing some problems in school because if you don't have a parent supervising at home, perhaps that kid is not getting what they need in terms of nutrition. Perhaps they're not getting any help with their homework assignments, so they just don't do it. Perhaps you have a teenager who's just refusing to go to school and there's nobody at home to make them, right? So in his opinion, society functions kind of like a body. So if there's something going wrong in the education system, well, you might notice some issues somewhere else. If something's happening within the family system, you're going to notice it in education. If our government is not doing what it's supposed to do, you're going to notice some social discord. We've noticed that today a lot, right? So that's the way he views it. So he argued that there's two types of social solidarity. Solidarity meaning things that bring society together. So first you have mechanical solidarity, and that's going to be strength and sameness. Everybody kind of does the same job. They're united by a shared religion and values. This doesn't really describe the US anymore. Does it describe some societies that exist within the US? Yes. So the Amish, for example, they do a lot of the same jobs. They share a same religious system, value system. But in general, mechanical societies are kind of rare. You don't really see that kind of solidarity anymore much. Instead, now that we've kind of expanded out, you'll notice more of an organic social solidarity. So that's going to be strength in difference and diversity. Everybody's got different skills, everybody's got different jobs that they're doing, and essentially we're united by dependency on one another, which is really true, right? So think about the job that you want. Think about the jobs that everybody else in your class wants. At some point, we're going to have to rely on each other, right? Just because I'm a teacher doesn't make me a doctor. And if I'm a doctor, I need somebody to instruct my kids. If I don't mow lawns, but I need somebody to help me with that. I need somebody to maintain my lawn. So we are bound together by dependency on one another. We don't all share the same religion. We don't all share the same values. We definitely don't do the same jobs. So today's societies, for most of them, it's going to be held together through organic solidarity. Next, division of labor. I want you to keep this term in mind. Division of labor essentially happens when people in a society begin to gain unique skills, which forces society's members to become dependent on the skills and services of one another, kind of like we just talked about. So we're moving away from kind of the traditional Amish idea of solidarity that's mechanical, everybody's kind of the same, we have strength and sameness, to now we're kind of outgrowing our ability to do that. We're starting to become more organic, everybody's getting different jobs, and we're going to start to rely on the skills and services of one another. Durkheim argued that a society becomes advanced and leans towards organic solidarity once there, is development of towns. That means that your population is going to increase. There's going to be increased modes of communication, like that's phone service. We're talking mass media, just all the different ways that we talk to each other. So it's not like we're just in a simple little town, right, where you can just go next door and get everything you need from the guy who lives next to you. We live in an organic society, and therefore we rely on division of labor to kind of subsist. So I want you to think about this. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but what does consciousness mean to you? So I want you to think about that for just a minute before we move on. So for Durkheim, there's two types of consciousness. So the first one's going to be individual consciousness, and this might be the kind of consciousness that a lot of you initially thought of. So that's going to be our personal values, beliefs, attitudes, and knowledge. So that's kind of our awareness of self, right? So going back to when we first started, we talked about milieu, our worldview. That's just going to be kind of what's happening in our own head, right? We're aware of ourselves, we're aware of our own personal values, attitudes, beliefs, and the knowledge that we have. And again, thinking to the sociological imagination, we're trying to go from us as individuals to we as a society. And this is where Durkheim chimes in. So he says, not only do we have individual consciousness, we also have a collective consciousness. And this is going to be the values, beliefs, and ideas that we all share that define who we are as a collective society, right? So our collective consciousness, we know that it's not okay to murder somebody, right? Our collective consciousness knows that like cannibalism isn't okay here. So we not only have an individual consciousness, but we also have the collective consciousness, which is kind of how we stick together as a society. Next, you've probably heard the term rituals. It does kind of tend to lean a lot towards religion and religious practice, but that's not all it is. So every now and then, society calls upon us to publicly reaffirm our commitment to our shared beliefs, ideas, and values. Durkheim says that we do this through rituals. So essentially, if we can see that others agree with us, we're going to be more likely to stick together and to feel connected as a society. So some examples of rituals that we have, weddings, right? So even though not everybody wants to get married anymore, it's maybe becoming less of an expected institution, it does still matter, right? It's still something that we celebrate. So we do still celebrate that unification of folks through marriage. So we celebrate weddings, sports. Sports are still a way that we reaffirm, the Kansas City Chiefs, we're a kingdom, we're a fan. We do holidays, right? So we affirm through giving kids basically 2 weeks off for Christmas, that Christmas is important here. Court hearings. So we still hold court hearings that people can come to as, a way to say, we do not agree that this behavior is all right. So when we show massive trials like the Casey Anthony trial, we have to kind of think, why did they put that on television? And it's kind of part of a ritual, right? It's a way of basically us seeing that somebody else got their comeuppance so that we all agree that they did something wrong and that that's not something that we tolerate as a society. So what do you think? Thinking about rituals here, are there any rituals that you do with your family, your friends, your school, your team that make you feel connected? Next, why do you do these things? Like, how does participating in these things make you feel? So just kind of think about that to yourself, kind of helps you to illustrate why we do ritual, even some things that we don't think of as ritual, they kind of are, right? Okay, so next I want you to think about this question as well. And it's going to seem like it's coming out of left field, but I will show you why it matters here in a second. So, what are some reasons that you think people are lost to suicide? Not a super pleasant thought, right? This is a difficult topic, but why do you think are some reasons that people die by suicide? I'll give you just a couple minutes to think about that. So Durkheim wondered too. Durkheim did a study of suicide, and he wanted to know, psychology's figured out that so it can come down to depression, it can come down to loneliness, things along those lines. But are there any social causes of suicide? So what are some of those external factors that might affect a person's decision to die by suicide? So some commonalities and patterns he was searching for in death records of a bunch of people who died by suicide. So is there anything that these people had in common that can help us find a pattern or a commonality or a trend? And he did find some. He found through his research that some social groups had higher rates of suicide than others. In his particular study, he found that Protestants were more likely. Men were more likely, those who were single or unmarried were more likely, and those who are elderly are more likely. Now, if somebody did this study today, you might find some different trends or some different social groups that have higher rates, right? So we know that folks who belong to the LGBTQ plus community have very high rates. Suicide amongst the elderly is unfortunately very high as well. So again, these are just the ones that he found at his time of the study. So one of the main things that he found was that suicide is often partially the result of social isolation from other people and institutions. Again, we're hitting that word again, institutions. So a family, their peers, their work, their school. So he called this feeling of aimlessness and despair resulting from a breakdown of these social bonds and values, anomie. It's kind of a weird word. It's spelled A-N-O-M-I-E, anomie. So he argued that, society really does matter. Society has a really big effect on a person's sense of well-being and of mental health. So a person who feels, I've lost all connections to my family, I don't really have many friends, I don't feel fulfilled or satisfied at work, I don't really have much of an education or interest in anything. You can kind of see how the breakdown of those social bonds and those bonds that we're supposed to have, right, to be successful in society can maybe put person at a higher risk of suicide. So think about this. Now we're thinking about external factors, right? So why are men over the age of 65 still one of the most likely social groups to die by suicide? What are some social factors at play here? Next, can you think of other problems that might affect some groups of people more than others? So I want you to kind of take what Durkheim was thinking in terms of, let's stop thinking purely based on psychological reasons for death by suicide, but let's also think about some of those social factors that make a difference. What are some social breakdowns that are happening? What's the role of loneliness and anomie? So this is Durkheim's bottom line. Essentially, the social world should be studied apart from the biological and social. It's an entirely different entity, right? So we're looking at society as a whole, not just things that plague people individually. Sometimes even highly personal problems like suicide have external social causes. Lastly, he said that society, again, is like a body with different parts that depend on one another's health to function as a whole. So when you see a breakdown in one social institution, it's very likely you're going to see some negative effects in some others. Okay, next we're going to move on to Marx. You've probably heard of Karl Marx. A lot of what is said about Karl Marx isn't what Karl Marx said, if that makes sense. So a lot of people kind of bristle at the thought of talking about Karl Marx because he's always linked to communism. I want you to kind of throw that to the back of your brain for now. Just act like it's not happening. Let's just focus on what Marx actually said. So first, Marx is a critic. He is a German political economist. He is interested in the relationships between the rich and the poor. So it is true that his primary interest was on class division and problems that occur between social classes. He argued that humans and histories are shaped by class conflict. So his idea is class. So keep that in mind. So for Karl Marx, at the time he was writing, he argued that history is shaped by class conflict between these two groups, the bourgeoisie. I know it's a very interesting word. In other words, the bourgeoisie are the rich, the people who have, the haves. The proletariat are the other side. Those are going to be the have-nots. Those are going to be the working class, those who work, those who don't own. For Marx, class matters. So essentially, Marx argued that how well you get along in society is determined by how much money you have. That is his bottom line. Those who have more money have more access to goods and services, such as well-connected social networks, better healthcare, reliable transportation, secure and affordable housing, better job opportunities, and greater opportunities for education and scholarships. So if you take away anything about Marx, it's that class matters. So the ability of yourself to succeed in a society often depends on where you come in terms of social class. So Marx, kind of like Comte, was interested in the outcome and the development of the French Revolution. Marx was interested in the Industrial Revolution. So essentially what happened during the Industrial Revolution was that production moved to factories where it used to be kind of run by mom and pop shops. Large corporate industries drove small businesses out. I mean, we see that a lot today. It's always unfortunate, when your favorite local restaurant gets bought out by a Chili's. Essentially, production, profit, and efficiency become more important than human happiness, connection, and well-being. So we can't talk about Marx without talking about capitalism, right? So capitalism is really complex. We could do a whole class on capitalism. But just to kind of get it down to its bare bones, to define capitalism, it is a political and economic system in which trade and industry are controlled by private individuals and businesses in pursuit of profit. So, that's things like Apple, Chili's, the Holiday Inn, right? So capitalism is all about the relations between the people involved in economic production. So you've got the rich folks who are going to own the machines, the factories, and the corporations, right? So that's Mark Zuckerberg, that have driven out small businesses by making more products, charging less, and paying their employees less for their labor. So again, we're looking at Amazon, we're looking at Barnes & Noble, we're looking at Shein, we're looking at Apple. The poor who depend on these corporations and entities to provide for themselves, so they're depending on them for the actual goods, because their products are fast and they're inexpensive. I'm gonna guess probably at least 50% of you all got your textbooks probably from Chegg or from Amazon. I'm not judging that. That's okay. Textbooks are extremely expensive, but it is very expensive to try to go directly to the distributor, right? So we depend on these corporations who kind of knock that price down, who can get us what we need in like a week or less. So we're very dependent on them. But also in a capitalist system, loyalty and reward to the worker is fairly low. And they're often forced to accept higher workloads for low or stagnant pay to ensure that profits continue to increase. So Marx was looking at the ways that capitalism can be kind of harmful. So according to Marx, capitalism can have some negative effects on society, particularly for the working class. So what he was seeing at the time he was writing was that folks who worked under capitalism, their creativity is a little bit stifled. So they often feel pretty bored, start to feel a sense of apathy towards their work, like my work doesn't matter, what's the point of this anyway? I don't feel successful, I don't feel fulfilled, I don't feel rewarded. For him, workers are always busy with little time for family or leisure, leading to a lot of burnout and poor overall well-being. I think a lot of us can we felt that in our life, right? So we don't get to go out as much as we want to because we're constantly working. We start to kind of feel ambivalent towards our work, like, it's just work. I don't really care about it. Maybe some people, I tend to get psychosomatic feelings when I'm feeling like overwhelmed. So my stomach will start hurting. I get lots of headaches. I get really tired and fatigued. Lastly, Marx said that capitalism can create a culture in which a person's income, job prestige, and productivity is the primary indicator of their personal value and worth. So you might say, oh, that person's a better person because, like, look, they're so put together. They're always busy all the time. They have a really fancy job. They make a lot of money. But that doesn't mean that the folks who don't are bad people, right? But we do kind of tend to get in that rut of thinking. So alienation is a term that I would like you to keep in mind. Marx argued that constant work is often mundane, repetitive, and unrewarding, and has separated people from like their sense of self, separated us from each other. We're not spending as much time together. People often feel separated from even their work. So again, their work isn't fulfilling. They're not very engaged in it. They don't really feel one way or another about it. And alienation is the sense that our own talents and abilities are taken over by someone else in a way that stifles our creativity and feelings of connectedness, fulfillment, and satisfaction. And for Marx, at the time he was writing, that's going to be the capitalist, right? So the companies that are demanding that you work hard with little to no reward, that you make sure that you're always on for overtime, that you're always keeping yourself busy, that you're putting your work before anything else. So think about this. Here's how we put it in perspective. Have you ever worked a job or been in an environment that made you feel unfulfilled? I have. What about the job made you feel unfulfilled? So I'll give an example for myself. I used to work at a dry cleaner's. It wasn't very exciting work. It was boring. It was repetitive. It was really mundane. I wasn't paid very well. Had to work a lot of overtime to make sure that people got their clothes back when they needed them. I didn't really feel very appreciated. My pay never increased despite my experience. So maybe you all have something that's kind of in the same vein. So how does it stay this way? Like if it's so bad, if the effects of this are so bad, why does it keep staying? Marx argues that the rich often keep the poor in unfulfilling jobs by convincing them of a few things. First, that busyness is a sign of success and productivity. That's a really easy trap to fall into, right? So you feel like, oh, because I'm busy, I'm succeeding. And that's kind of the message that's put forth. We're also told that hard work will eventually pay off. I wish this was true, but I'm sure I know and you know a lot of really hardworking folks that are really struggling. So hard work does not always pay off. There's also the messaging that having more things will bring happiness. So that's overconsumption, right? So if you get on TikTok or on Instagram, you're seeing like these massive hauls, and that's supposed to make you feel good, right? So the more you have, the happier you'll be. And these are just kind of the messages that come out, and they seem positive at first, but then when you start to think about them, you're kind of like, oh, maybe this isn't really working because I'm still really struggling. I still feel unfulfilled. I'm not really happy with all this stuff. Now I'm just mad that I bought it all. Marx calls this false consciousness. So he argues that these messages, like we just talked about last, often lull people into a state of acceptance and false hope. Well, you know, if I just keep working harder, I'll get a reward. If I keep working harder, I'll get a promotion. If I keep buying more things, I'll be able to fill like a void that's in myself that I need filled. That if I just stay busy, everybody will be convinced that I'm successful and that I'm productive. So these are Marx's predictions about what would happen. Essentially, Marx believed that capitalism would fall. He said this would happen when the poor would eventually greatly outnumber the rich. The poor would eventually find Durkheim's solidarity. So again, going back to the sociological imagination, realize, you know, I'm not the only one who's feeling this way. I'm not the only one who's feeling upset, tired, overworked. Like we all are. And then the poor would eventually see that they're being exploited and oppressed by the capitalist class. The tactics and messaging of the rich would no longer work because people would eventually see, you know, my hard work isn't paying off. I'm tired of being busy. I don't want to be busy anymore. I want more free time. I don't need all this stuff. This is just taking up room. Lastly, he argued that the poor would eventually unite to overflow and replace the existing system with one or more equitable systems that are more nurturing to human needs. So have Marx's predictions come to pass? Some of them, right? So you can kind of start to see some of his predictions they're starting to work. I think people are starting to kind of wisen up to the fact that, you know, overwork isn't great. Overconsumption is not great either. So some of them are working. We definitely are still living under capitalism, right? So capitalism has not fallen. And there's some positive and some bad about capitalism, right? This isn't just like it doesn't work at all. For Marx, it doesn't work at all. But we'll see some folks don't necessarily totally agree with him. But at the end of the day, I hope that you can at least take a little bit of what Marx said. Again, a lot of contention surrounds Marx, but this is just what Marx said, right? And I want you to keep this in mind about all of the theorists. They can only write at their time, right? So Durkheim, Marx, and Weber might jump into our time and come up with a totally different idea or a totally different perception. So just kind of keep that in mind. So Marx's bottom line is that solidarity is not possible until we acknowledge class conflict. He argues that capitalism has stripped away our creativity and passion. He argues that the poor folks or the working class have become robots to increase profits for the rich and do not reap the rewards of their labor. Next, he says that our culture of busyness has left us disconnected. And lastly, and most importantly, he argues that change is possible if we're able to unite and come up with a better plan. So lastly, we're going to talk about Weber. He's kind of the big picture guy. He was a jack of all trades. He was involved in politics, law, sociology, of course, economics, and philosophy. He was kind of branching off of Marx. He was interested in the development of capitalism. So where did capitalism even come from and where's it going? And folks' attitudes towards work. He wanted to understand how the US was different from other countries. So what is it about US capitalism that makes it the way it is? And he wanted to understand the role of religion in daily life. So his most famous book is called The Protestant Ethic. In this book, Weber argues that capitalism arose partly as a result of the adoption of the Protestant ethical standards of hard work, frugality, so making sure that we're not spending a lot of money, and efficiency, that we get as much done in as little time as possible. Weber wanted to demonstrate the link between cultural values like hard work, frugality, and efficiency, and attitudes towards the economy. So how did these attitudes eventually come to shape our systems? How did they bleed into our institutions? So think about this. What are some ways that our cultural attitudes and values have shaped the way that we think and feel about money? And this might be a little different for each of you. So I just want you to think about it a little bit. But I do want you to try to step away from maybe your own individual perceptions of money and think about it on a cultural, societal level. So what does TV suggest to us about money? What does our schooling suggest to us about money? Weber argued that it's the consequences of unchecked capitalism that are the problem and not necessarily capitalism itself. This is where he diverges from Marx a little bit. Marx was absolutely like, overthrow capitalism. Capitalism doesn't work, throw it out the window. Weber he agreed with Marx about the negative effects of capitalism, but believed that it could be reformed. So he argued that while human action was once motivated by things like emotions, values, social interactions, it's now driven by profit, productivity, efficiency, and consumerism. And we call this way that it's now driven rationalization. So we're looking at our bottom line here, right? The bottom line is profit, productivity, efficiency, and consumerism. So how do we achieve this rationalization? How did it even come to be? So we're going to talk about bureaucracy, and you've probably heard this word before. For Weber, he argued that we achieve rationality through the creation of highly structured and predictable bureaucracies. So what are some characteristics of bureaucracy? So they're highly regulated, extremely inflexible, there's a very clear hierarchy, and they're very rule-based. And he argued that bureaucracy simultaneously provides us with some sense of order while also restricting our freedom. So a really good example of how bureaucracy works is if you have a financial problem here at K-State and you try to call, you're probably going to have to talk to 10 people before you get your problem solved, right? Because somebody will answer and be like, oh, that's not really my job. I'm going to pass you off to here. Oh, well, did you try X, Y, and Z? Nope, I'm going to pass you off to here, right? So very rigid, very inflexible, highly regulated, strictly rule-based, and very clear hierarchy. Everybody's got a job to do and nothing else. That's not my job, that's somebody else's. So this is Weber's bottom line. He argued again that capitalism should be reformed to decrease its negative effects, but not necessarily thrown out the window. He argued that our economic system has roots in our cultural values and attitudes, so it doesn't just come from nothing, right? So our cultural attitudes and values do absolutely shape the way that we think about money, how it's spent, and how it's managed. Next, the goal of capitalism is rationalization. So again, driving towards profit, productivity, and efficiency. And we achieve this through bureaucracy. Again, very rigid, very structured, rule-based hierarchies. Rationalization helps us to increase profits, productivity, consumption, and efficiency. However, it does limit our freedom and our ability to enjoy life. So kind of closing out this section on social theorists, what was something that any of the three theorists or multiple theorists have said or argued that really spoke to you? And that can be any of them. Are there any issues that the theorists pointed out at the time that they were writing to you that you still think are relevant or important today? So I want you to kind of take away these questions. So lastly, I just did a quick recap on each of the individual theorists. So we'll run through them just real quick. Durkheim's recap, he wanted to study society like a human body. We're all organs that are interdependent on the functioning of one another. If something goes wrong in one area of society, like the family, it's likely that problems will arise in other areas of the social body, like education. If we continue to place blame on the individual instead of looking for larger social problems, things are always going to stay the same and nobody's going to ever provide for one another's needs. As society becomes more complex, we use rituals as a way to reaffirm our dedication to shared beliefs and practices. Again, these are things like weddings, funerals, holidays, sporting events. And rituals help us tap into the collective consciousness that collects everybody in society and keeps us together. Even highly personal issues like suicide have often both psychological and sociological causes, like isolation, lack of guidance, lack of social services, things along those lines. So Marx recap, class matters, right? He was critical of the capitalist system and takes notes on its effects on the working class people. He believed that how well a person gets along in society is determined by their wealth and access to resources. He argued that capitalism stifles the human spirit and their capacity for creativity. The culture of business has alienated or distanced people from themselves, each other, and made them feel isolated from their work. The media and many workplaces often teach us that the culture of busyness is good and that staying busy and productive is a sign of success. And we talked about false consciousness, if you remember. There is hope for the potential for the poor to grow in number till they're too large to control and replace the standing system. Again, that was his ultimate idea of revolution. Weber, again, he was a jack of all trades, agreed with Marx that capitalism had some negative effects, but didn't agree with Marx that it needed to go totally out the window. He wanted to understand why the values and attitudes of the Calvinist religion survived, even though the religion diminished over time. So where did those ideas of hard work, frugality, and efficiency come from, and where did they go? For capitalism to succeed, a society must pursue rationalization, which drives human motivation according to that profit, production, and efficiency. Bureaucracies are there to achieve rationalization, to provide us with rules, and to keep order. He argued that people are born into the confines of a society driven by production, profit, and efficiency, and are predisposed to its consequences. He called this the iron cage, but you don't need to know that specifically. Even though he believed that these issues were problematic and restrictive, Weber also believed that they did work favorably to some extent and did not provide many solutions. So that's kind of just a very brief overview of kind of the initial start of the sociological perspective. So again, we're kind of looking at where it all came from, why it matters. And when we talk about theory, I also want to mention that theory, it's just an explanation, right? It's not, we always say like theory is an educated guess. Yes and no. It does have some scientific rigor that is involved. And we do need to note that not one theory can explain everything, right? So you might notice that you might like a little bit of Weber, a little bit of Durkheim, and a little bit of Marx. You might not fully agree with any one of them, and that's okay. There's going to be lots of theories that can provide lots of different explanations for social problems. Social problems in society are way too complex for one theory to solve them all. So just kind of keep that in mind as we move forward in the class. That is all I have for you today. Thank you for listening to this lecture, and I look forward to more.